Thanks a lot, Abhiraj, Megha, and Sanjay for coming in on the next session, which is what makes a good ESOP policy. A lot of early stage founders here, folks who are building out their teams, looking at how they can balance out building out their team with ESOPs. Also, in the context, Abhiraj, of what you've done in terms of giving out liquidity to over 180 team members at Urban Clap. It will be interesting for this session for us to actually get a sense of what makes a good ESOP policy. How do you roll it out? How do you talk about it? And to lead this session, we have Megha from CNBC TV18 joining us, and Sanjay Jha, who's the co-founder of Let's Venture and also heads up My Startup Equity, which is our product for cap table and ESOP management. So over to you guys. Megha.
Thank you, Saina, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And I think we're now going to talk about ESOPs, which is become such an important topic, and companies like Urban Company have been setting the right example in terms of what a good ESOP policy looks like. I've been told that there are many first-time entrepreneurs and very early-stage entrepreneurs here as well. So let's get the basics out of the way. ESOPs is essentially an employee stock ownership plan, which basically gives benefits to workers and gives them an ownership interest in the company. ESOPs also has other benefits, which allows employees to buy stock in a closely held company to facilitate a succession plan as well. Now, for the longest time, ESOPs was considered paper money, and we have come way past that stage. People have started seeing value in it. Of course, at the inception, a startup's valuation is make-believe, and hence it is believed that ESOP is make-believe. But several ESOP sales within the Indian startup ecosystem have debunked that and made people understand that, hey, if you stick around, you are going to benefit from that. And, from an employer point of view, it gives workers a chance to work in the interest of the company since they are shareholders, and that's a win-win for everybody. But how do you structure that, and what is a good ESOP policy? To discuss that, we have the next 30 minutes. So actually, let me start by talking to Abhiraj in terms of the fact that this is the third ESOP sale. And in your previous interviews, you've always said that whenever you get an opportunity, one must look at giving an opportunity to the employees to liquidate their ESOPs. But Abhiraj, why now, especially during a time where we are seeing furloughs, job cuts, pay cuts, and this is the time that you chose to host this third sale. So talk to us about that.
Thank you, Megha, and thanks to the team for having me. I think short answer to your question is precisely for that reason. That we chose to do it now. Given the environment that we find ourselves in, where companies are, letting go of talent or, cutting salaries, it's obviously a war for talent out there. And, we want to, I think we've, over the years, invested heavily in creating what we believe is a world-class and very, very employee-friendly ESOP program. And we felt this was a good time to actually, sort of create liquidity for our existing employees, as well as take our employer brand and our ESOP program to the next level. So, those reasons.
Okay, Abhiraj, you started out in 2014 and ventured into an anyway space that did not exist. So you basically created this entire market. There was a lot on your plate already. But at what point during your startup journey did you decide that, hey, you know what? I need to have a company that not only organizes this unorganized sector in the country, but also becomes the benchmark when it comes to setting up an ESOP policy? At what point did that get bumped up right on top of your priority list?
I think the value of creating a high quality ESOP program was something that I realized, I would say, pretty quickly.
Okay.
And let me just put it this way. See, any ESOP program that gets created, results in dilution of existing shareholders. So as founders as well as other investors, you will get diluted, and any incremental additions on top of that ESOP program that you put back in, this comes at the cost of existing shareholder dilution. But one hypothesis I had early on, and which I think has at least turned out to be fairly accurate, is that this is the best form of dilution. I mean, the return on this dilution that you get is I would say multiple times the return on raising any kind of capital. So that, I think, with that mindset, if an entrepreneur approaches the whole ESOP program with the view that, hey, this isn't a zero-sum game, wealth is infinite, and if I allow my team members and my employees to have ownership in the company, they'll just end up being more long-term, create more wealth, build a larger company, and all of us will win. That the fundamental mindset with which we start companies anyways, which is that you can create value from it's zero at the beginning, but over time you create immense value. So if you share some of that value, you'd be surprised how quickly that compounds and how much employees can then give back.
All right. For the benefit of everyone who's tuned in, let me just say that Urban Company announced an employee stock sale program, and this is the third and the largest sale to date, and it's worth $5 million. And you're not the only company who's managed to do that. The fact that there are several other companies, be it your Flipkart or Myntra, and they've all managed to validate the idea of ESOPs and reassured employees that who trust them with their careers and join companies that may or may not work. It's a sense of reward. Sanjay, let me ask you at this point, many companies, including Urban Company, choose to award ESOPs during appraisal cycles, or they choose to award ESOPs even as a reward during various internal recognition programs. And that's an indication of a good organizational culture. And the way Abhiraj spoke about the fact that he realized very early on as to how this is something that has to be priority for Urban Company is sign that they have had their head in the right place and they wanted to design a good ESOP policy. And so far, what we've heard is that ESOP is essentially a win-win for everybody. But there are several examples of bad ESOP policies as well. And I'm sure that you've been privy to many such companies and examples of that. So take us through that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Megha. At My Startup Equity, we started building this product almost a year ago. And, last 6 months, we have seen over like 70 startups now using this product. So you are right. I have seen many policies and talked to founders and their teams on, how their policies have been and whether it is employee friendly or, how does it help founders or company protect their rights. So, couple of good examples. Obviously, I can't take the names, but, there is a person I know who was working at a unicorn, and at the time he was leaving the company, he had, of course, a good amount of vested options, right? And to exercise that, as you know, in India, you have to pay a lot of tax, right? While the exercise price is a small amount, or could be a small amount, but the tax is definitely a huge amount because valuations of these companies would be very high, right? So to pay this tax, and of course, the company had given only a finite period, right, for exercising. So this guy had to actually mortgage his house and use that amount to exercise that that stock. So basically, he didn't want to let it go because he valued that stock so much. At the same time, he had to pay up, so he somehow got that money to pay it up, and so on. Other problems, I have seen, right? Some of the other founders have, a different kind of clauses which sort of have disproportionate powers to the board of the company, which allows company to forcibly sort of buy back vested options even at a current FMD, which could be sometimes not so employee friendly. So there are a few examples that I can quote, and of course there are very many we can go through it during the course of this discussion.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's do that. The fact that when we were hearing Abhiraj talk about ESOPs, it almost sounded like here, make 70% of my what I get in terms of compensation. It's ESOPs is all good. And then when you spoke about ESOPs, one is at the fence and is like, wait a second, that there are things that I need to know further. So, give us a 101 in terms of how startup founders, along with their investors, can help build out a good ESOP policy. What is the 101? And of course, utmost transparency is right on top of the list. But what is it that companies have to keep in mind while building an ESOP policy?
Yeah, sure, Megha. So if I can take that up, definitely, one of the most important things, and that was the example I gave you, right, is the exercise period, right? How long do you allow employees to exercise? Of course, when they are they are employed within the company, I mean, probably they can exercise anytime during that period, right? That is hopefully given. But what happens if they left? They might have served in the company for 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever that may be, right? If they leave the company, what is the time period you allow them to exercise? That becomes a very, very talked about point currently in the ecosystem, right? And of course, companies like Flipkart, companies like Urban Company, like Abhiraj, they have done fantastic job. And I saw the news in the press saying that they have infinite exercise period. That's amazing, right? Employees leave, but they still have time to exercise anytime during the future whenever there is a liquidity event, right? So that gives them huge amount of flexibility and takes any burden off their head. They think that their time spent in the company has been taken care of. I mean, thou has served the company, thou will get the ESOP, right? I mean, that should be the mantra, right?
Well, in a very straightforward and utopian world, that sounds like that should be the basic rule. But since Sanjay, you spoke about Urban Company's ESOP program, let me go ahead and for everyone who's tuned in, talk about what that program has in terms of the fact that they have an exercise price of ₹1 accelerated vesting, a flat 4-year vesting schedule, which means it's 25% per year. And as you mentioned, an infinite hold period to exercise the ESOPs, even after the employee leaves the company, which is exactly what you said. If you've served, you shall be rewarded. But Abhiraj, this sounds too good to be true. So what's the catch here?
There's no catch. I mean, this is fairly standard. For example, in the Valley, all the terms that I've mentioned are not outlandish at all. Even some of the Indian companies have similar terms. Flipkart for the longest time had all of these terms and not an infinite hold period, but a 10-year hold period, which is large enough and good enough. Or the company going public / getting bought out, whichever is earlier. Look, I think the fundamental point that you're trying to raise, Megha, is what is the why should one have an employee-friendly ESOP policy, right?
More importantly, what holds back companies from doing that and having a policy which is a win-win for everybody?
Yeah, I think, in my view, the only thing that I can think of is that founders haven't fully thought it through. And amongst the many things that they have to manage on a day-to-day basis, building a business, and building a business is hard, this hasn't taken precedence and priority. Because if you fundamentally as a founder believe in an ESOP program and believe in creating wealth for your team members, then you would want to make it the most friendly ESOP program out there, right? Otherwise, it's okay not to have an ESOP program. That extreme is also fine, where you say, look, I will pay comp and I will pay cash comp today, and there won't be any ESOP program because I don't believe in the concept. But if there is belief in the concept, and if one believes that an ESOP program helps create wealth, helps get employees to become more long-term vested, then it's helpful to create a program which is not sort of bait and switch, right? And I think over a period, if you have an ESOP program that's a bait and switch, one example of that is, let's say you have a 3-month or a 6-month hold period. It's effectively a bait and switch, right? An employee, while he's joining, isn't going to look through the fine print and ask that question. I haven't had a single employee, and we've given ESOPs out to 670 employees. and I have educated almost all of them about the ESOP program. I haven't had a single one of them organically ask me what the whole period is, right? Because it's just not something that's top of mind for a lot of employees. Anyways, ESOPs is not considered to be a great instrument. There aren't enough examples of wealth creation, etc., etc. But when the company does do well, and then they're about to leave, many employees realize on their last day that, oh, now I have only 60 or 90 or 120 days to exercise this ESOP, right? And that to them is not just a rude shock, it almost feels like betrayal, right? And that word of mouth over a period of time will catch up with your company. So if you're building the company for the long haul, you want to start with the right principles for ESOP, and it won't reward you on day one. We are now 6 years into building urban companies, and we had as good an ESOP program today on day one as we have today. But after 6 years, 3 secondaries, more than 250 people benefiting from it. Now, finally, people are talking about it and saying this is gold standard. So it has to be patient. You have to be patient, and you have to allow it to, this is like good karma. Eventually, it will pay off.
Right. Sanjay, if you heard Abhiraj talk about the fact that how he was educating over 670 employees and talking about ESOPs, and then, but at the same time, he spoke about the fact that anyway, it's not considered as a wealth creation instrument or a good instrument that people would want to bet on. How do you change that perception about ESOPs? What does the ecosystem have to do? Of course, one thing that Abhiraj said, that you're either on board or you're not on board, right? That's one thing. But if you are on board, what is your role then as an investor, as a founder, as someone who's part of the ecosystem to change that perception about ESOPs?
Yeah, so I would probably answer 2-3 questions in there. First of all, education is not just for employees. I think founders need to be educated a lot, right? And at my startup equity, I think that's where we started, right? And we gave them the tools. Of course, that is our online product. We gave them a free to use standard and what we think is a model ESOP policy document, and free to use tool, right? And everything that through which they can probably build that ESOP rollout within the company in a better way. And of course, you talked about education to employees, and we have had a lot of sessions, including one session which was done by Abhiraj, where a lot of founders, including employees, another one Deepak Abbott from Paytm took, where a lot of employees are, especially working in startups, and they didn't have the knowledge of, how does ESOPs help them, or what are the success stories, right? What should a potential employee, going through a interview should ask about ESOPs, right? And all these questions were answered, and those are the educational exercises we are doing to help build awareness among not just employee and founders, but the entire ecosystem, right? And you talked lastly the perception about ESOPs, right? I think a lot of buybacks and success stories we have had, starting from companies like Flipkart, where thousands and probably tens of thousands of people got ESOPs and made money. Of course, before that there was Infosys, Naukri, right, where the ESOPs got a lot of employees covered, as well as there was a success story built out. So these kind of success stories, and we are trying to see how we can publicize them, or reach out that to broader number of people in the ecosystem. All this will definitely help the perception of ESOPs in the employee base. We see currently that when employees or potential employees come to talk to founders during the job interviews, I think they are pretty open, and especially people who have worked few years in the startup, they are pretty open to balance the ESOPs versus salary cuts. Of course, somebody coming right out of college, they may not be considering, or they may not be aware of the fruits of it, but once they are through a few years in the startup ecosystem, they quickly know, and they are willing to take a bet in terms of getting a higher leverage on the ESOP, and potentially gaining from that in the long term.
Okay, so at this point, you as an investor, are you doing your bit? Abhiraj as an entrepreneur is doing his bit. But do you think at some point government policies is something where it's falling short on? Because it's clearly not favorable for ESOPs. And that's something that's coming in the comments as well that I'm seeing while we are in the middle of this session. The fact that there is tax levied when you are buying ESOPs as opposed to when you're selling it. And several such factors push people in the direction of not being favorable towards ESOPs or not wanting to pick that as an option. So I'd let both Abhiraj and you, Sanjay, starting with you, put out there in terms of what needs to change when it comes to government policies and their sentiment towards ESOPs.
Yeah, so I think when the tax or budget session was coming up in March, we had talked about this a lot. In fact, once I had appeared on CNBC as well, where there was a discussion around the ESOP tax, and there was a lot of hope built in the ecosystem that, hey, probably the ESOP exercise tax would probably go away or something like that. But what came out was not something that was meaningful. It was something that was changed, but it was not very meaningful. So while I would still hope that something on the ESOP exercise tax happens in the next budget, but regardless, I think there are ways where we can still make it fruitful. I think ESOP liquidity programs, in fact we are working with companies or several companies where we drive regular ESOP liquidity program completely outside of their primary rounds, right? And these regular events can be used where the employees sell their ESOPs, get the money, and use that money to pay the tax. So at the end of the day, he doesn't have to sell out anything from his pocket. He's getting money and immediately paying tax, right? So therefore, there are ways in which we are looking at solving this problem. And if as it gets adopted widely, this could be a good solution for that ESOP problem.
Yeah. Abhiraj, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think just a couple of points, and we've made representations from the side of CII's e-commerce council to the government recently on this aspect. And I think the government's also looking into this now in a more holistic fashion. I think there are, three things to solve. The first is taxation should happen at the point of sale, not the point of exercise. Because when the employee is exercising his ESOPs, he's not realizing any hard cash or liquidity, right? So it doesn't make any sense to tax the employee at the point of exercise. Generally, that taxation happens because there's a difference between the fair market value and the price at which the employee is getting it. Fair enough, but then that taxation should be deferred to the point where the employee actually sells the ESOPs and realizes benefit. So that's one. The second thing is, because you're taxing at the point of exercise, what you also do is you're forcing the employee to go down the path of short-term capital gains and ends up paying 10% higher than if the employee had held that for, let's say, 2 years. And typically from the point of exercise to the point of sale, 2 years will pass. And then sell it, in which case, he or she would be levied long-term capital gains, which is 10% lower. Anyways, private companies are taxed 10% higher than public companies, even when it comes to long-term capital gains. So, if an employee was to hold this into the company becoming a public equity, the difference in taxation is massive. It's, 10% plus STT versus almost 33, 34%, right? And the third is the law today doesn't allow founders to get ESOPs. So as a promoter or founder in the company, you can't get ESOPs. And I think that also needs to change because globally that isn't the case. So these are the three things that we have proposed to the government to look into.
Okay. Thank you for putting it out in terms of bullet points for us. And I think since we are almost, it's time that we have to wrap up this session. So I want to de-jargonize this entire thing. We've spoken, of course, about what makes a good ESOP policy, what your policy was, the startup ecosystem from a government point of view. But I want to come back to a very basic question, especially because there are so many young entrepreneurs and early stage founders who are joining this chat, Abhiraj, is to how do you make the decision whether you want to incorporate an ESOP program as part of your startup or not?
I would say there is very, very little downside to doing it. Right? Typically, you will start with, let's say, a 10% ESOP program. So that means that if you have 100% of the company, then you're saying, okay, now I have 90% and I give away 10%. Now that may feel like you're actually now owning lesser of the company, but the reality is that for that 10%, which will be shared over, let's say, a few hundred employees in the lifetime of the company, the kind of ownership that they will bring to the table, the kind of effort that they will put in, it's very easy to understand, right? As a founder, you're putting your heart and soul into the company because you own shares in the company. If I take your ownership to zero, you'll stop working. Similar for employees as well, right? Employees beyond salary, feel a high degree of ownership if they feel that they have equity in the company. And on day one, they may not feel that way, right? It will take time for them to realize that this isn't paper money. You have to follow through. So if you decide to go down that path, be committed. It's a multi-year journey to creating value from that ESOP program. Be committed to it. And if you don't decide to go down that path, then that's also fine. But I don't know of any large company out there that is getting created in this day and age which doesn't have a high quality ESOP program. So you're fundamentally signing up at some level for creating a smallish business.
All right. So, if you are looking at building something for the long term and aspire to build a large company, then this is something that should be a part of your blueprint early on. Sanjay, at this point, let me ask you, what is the role of the investor at that point, who has sat through several meetings with several entrepreneurs in across different sectors as part of their portfolio? How should then the investor help navigate a young startup founder to build out a good policy? And what do you do if there is a difference in opinion at that point? How should an entrepreneur deal with that?
Yeah, so Megha, I think in all our funding rounds that we do at letsventure.com, it is very standard that everybody creates an ESOP pool, and of course, all our lead investors are bought into that decision. But that ESOP pool gets created right at the time of the very first angel round that startups are raising on our platform, and that ESOP pool is, of course, both founders as well as investors know that the ESOP pool will go a long way in terms of attracting and rewarding the top talent, right? And that is exactly agreeing with Abhiraj that any company today we see any good startup and everybody is looking at ESOP. I will go one step further, right? I will say that if you are looking to build a startup which is going to grow and going to make it big, going to raise several funding rounds, and regardless, you see that your employees need to be part of the value creation and value sharing or sharing of wealth. You can institute ESOP policy even from day one, right? I would go to that extent. And our products like My Startup Equity makes it very easy, right? These companies, right? I mean, whenever they raise their next round, when investors ask for it, they eventually create their ESOP pool, right? And what stops them from creating that same pool, from day one, right? So that they can easily, instead of telling their employees that, hey, I promise to give you so and so, instead of them give them a proper letter and get it signed so that it becomes a proof for both the parties, rather than promise them and then probably for few years nothing happens. On the other side, found the employees are worried that, hey, is this going to come to me, the ESOP letter, or not? And so that's why I say that I will take the whole ESOP conversation to an extent where you are a founder, ambitious founder, you want to share wealth with your employees, you go ahead and create your ESOP from day one, and that is the right way to do it.
Okay, before I wrap, I just want to ask one last question to Abhiraj, because no conversation is complete without the mention of COVID-19 or the pandemic these days. So, Abhiraj, I just want to put this out very simply. The fact that this was the third sale that you were doing, typically you've been doing that in cycle of 2 years. It started, I think, in 2017, then the next one was 2018, and now 2020. So when the pandemic hit, or when you were hit by this crisis and operations were shut down, just simply tell me, at that point, did it feel like you would be able to host the next sale anytime soon? At that point, did having an ESOP program feel like a pro or a con?
So we were actually going. We were going to do it. Just prior to the pandemic hitting, and we had internally announced that it was going to happen. And the investor who has not followed through, had requested that this was something that they wanted to do. They wanted to go ahead with it even when the pandemic hit, but I felt that it was unfair to ask them to go ahead with it because of the situation that the company was in, right? And I think in April our business went to near zero because of the lockdowns, etc. So I went back and told the investor that, look, it's great that you still want to go ahead and do it, and I admire your follow through. And but I would request that we put a pause on this program until the business somewhat bounces back. I will feel confident as a founder to go through with it only then. And I think it's an important role as a founder. You're not, as a founder, you're responsible for all stakeholders, not just your employees or your customers, or like every single stakeholder is important. And one would argue actually the most important stakeholder is the shareholder. Since then, the recovery has been strong, and the bounce back has been strong, and we're now back to almost 100% of where we were before COVID. So we touched base earlier this month and said, look, things look like they're coming back to where they were before COVID. Things have recovered well, and let's go back and complete what we had paused because of COVID. So that's how it kind of panned out.
Well, I think that sums up the discussion that we were looking to have in terms of whether you should include an ESOP program or not, what is a good ESOP program versus a bad ESOP program, and how should investors help navigate entrepreneurs through that planning. I think I'm done with my set of questions. Saina, over to you. Do we want to take any of the questions? Do we have time for that?
We do have a few minutes. Actually, if there's any of you that has a direct question for Abhiraj, I know Sanjay is going to be with us for a longer period of time, but if you all have any direct questions for Abhiraj, why don't you all go ahead? You can unmute and ask, or we'll follow up on the chat window, and then have Abhiraj go ahead with the rest of his weekend.
Saina, I see a lot of questions already there in the chat.
Yeah, so I'm going to take one that's coming from Rahul Gupta, which is, how can we all work together to improvise on, okay, I think the government policy piece we've done with. How do you bridge the... Okay, so I think this one is important, right? Abhiraj, you might want to speak to this because you also said that you actually one by one spoke to a lot of your early team members. How do you bridge the knowledge gap between ESOPs and the company and its junior most team members, as their contribution is as important as that of a VP in your company, right? So how do you talk to it? How do you create transparency? Any processes that you all had at Urban Company as you all grow, to make it easy to talk to 600 people about ESOPs?
Yeah, good question. I think I'll answer this at two levels. Number one, the communication has to be simple and very de-jargonized, as Megha said. So keep it very simple. Tell them what are the core 4 or 5 pillars of your ESOP policy, and keep on repeating, almost like a stuck tape recorder, those 4 or 5 pillars, right? So when they hear it enough number of times, they realize that, okay, this is gold standard. So in our case, those 4 pillars are strike price of ₹1, accelerated vesting, an infinite hold period, and a linear 25% vesting schedule. So say it enough number of times, so that when somebody's woken up in the middle of the night and say, what are the 4 core pillars of ESOP policy, they're able to sort of blurt it out, right? I have blogged about this 2 or 3 times. It's basically these 4 pillars haven't changed for the last 5 years. They're consistent. We've spoken about them internally in town halls. We've written blogs. We tell every team member when they join about this. It's a part of our documentation, etc., etc. Every time we do a liquidity event, we talk about it. Second thing is, don't shy away from complexity. I mean, at the end of the day, creating a good, ESOP structure is going to require, the legal documentation. It's going to require an online portal where the employee can go and see, their shares and the paperwork around it. At some point of time, you'll have to, go down the path of building a trust, etc., right? And there are certain costs associated with doing these things, but don't shy away from that complexity. So, using a very simple framework design principle that I have, which is, front end simplicity, back end complexity. So make sure that, outwardly facing to your employees, the communication is simple, straightforward. But anybody who wants to go into the nitty-gritties and understand it, then they have the ability to do that.
All right. The other one, it's coming to me actually on the private chat, but I'll just read it out. Is how big should the ESOP pool be right in the beginning? And then, how do you manage that as you keep fundraising? Abhiraj, you want to talk from your example and maybe extrapolate to what you see founders do these days?
Yeah. So rule of thumb is 10% at the very inception. So, if you're sort of unfunded company and founders hold 100%, founders go down to 90, and then 10% is held by employees. And then a top up, I would say, of 1%, every year, 0.5 to 1, depending upon how aggressive you want to be, 0.5 to 1% every year for the rest of your life.
And then
that's like Amazon tells its shareholders even today that, they can expect 0.5 to 1% dilution because of ESOP. So that's, So
and then that you split, Abhiraj, I mean, just breaking it down for everyone here over there, does the founder continue to dilute, or do the investors pitch in, and what have you seen?
No, everybody gets diluted by the percentage of shares that they hold in the company. So it's like any other dilution. Everybody gets diluted. Typically, the first creation is dilutive for the founders. Although some founders are able to negotiate with the investors and say that it will happen after the round, and therefore investors will also participate in the dilution. But it's somewhat rare. But beyond that, I think everybody gets diluted.
All right. Thank you very much, Abhiraj. I think we've gone through all the questions. And if there's anything additionally that comes up, I know you and your team are super accessible. So we'll try and get some more questions answered if anything comes up. Thanks a lot, Abhiraj, for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks a lot. Megha for coming in as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Abhiraj, Megha.